Here we are on part two, guys. The last West and the new South. This is not the easiest thing to review for the sake of continuity. So I'm going to try to make some sense while talking about all this. So, look, as we talk about the post-Civil War West, right, we see this term, the Great American Desert, which refers to the 100th meridian. No, not relative. Here's the geography of the 100th meridian. Think about the Texas Panhandle, right, and where that sticks up, right, and then it cuts off the Oklahoma Panhandle. That's the 100th meridian going up, okay? And that was the area that was always skipped over. Manifest Destiny, we went down to Texas. We went out to Oregon, right? California or bust. And we just skipped the Great Plains because it was seen as something that was too hard to farm. Let me make sure I'm recording this. Okay. And that was an area that had the Plains Indians tribes, massive buffalo herds, right? And it was great grazing area, but it was thought with 15 inches of rain, like brutal heat in the summer, what do you call those, blizzards in the winter, it just got skipped over. And then with the coming of the Homestead Act after the Civil War and 160 acres of free land, that land started to get settled, right? Also, when you talk about mineral resources, like they were kind of skipped over. That was found out more in the West. Obviously, we've got the Black Hills in South Dakota, but you've got like the Comstock Lode in Virginia. You've got the strike in San Francisco. You've got strikes in Colorado, the different areas. So as we look at some of this, oh man, this is tough. All right, I'm just going to stick part by part here. So as we look at Western development, all right, originally it was open range, right? You had longhorn cattle that I believe originated in Mexico, and they were tough and they could withstand the environment that was out there in the Southwest, or really in Texas. Vasqueros were, I apologize for my Spanish, that's terrible. Mexican cowboys. And this was when you had open ranges, you rounded up the herd, and you took them on long cattle drives up the Chisholm Trail, the Goodnight Loving Trail, right? You took them to Dodge City, Kansas, to Abilene, to Wichita, and then you sent them off to Chicago to be slaughtered. But this didn't really last because all the cattle pretty much died in the winter of 83 or 86. I can't remember which winter of the 80s. And you started to see, as more and more people started to live out there, because the cattle drives are in the late 1860s, early 1870s, as more and more land got settled, thanks to the Homestead Act, thanks to understanding dry farming, which, look, I'm not an agronomist, like you just plow down real deep and you get to better soil. And you plant Russian wheat because it's hardier. Trust me, they found wheat that would grow out there in an area where you don't get a lot of rain, and they learned how to plow down, and they started to fence their farm in because there's no wood, but you can use barbed wire, and now all of a sudden the idea of an open range went away. Of course, the Indians are there, and we learned in class, like the Fort Laramie Treaty, as long as the grass grows and the water runs. But obviously, Indians resisted going on these reservations, especially when a lot of the deals were crooked, and they resisted. And there are very few Indian victories. There was the victory of the Sioux up in Minnesota, and of course the bad luck of General Custer, who showed up looking for a small group of Indians and found they had all met at the Little Bighorn River where he was slaughtered. And you saw an effort after all of these, the 1870s is the time of Indian wars. And by the 1880s, all of the Plains Indian tribes have been herded under really small reservations. And the killing of the buffalo made that inevitable, in addition to military defeat. So you saw the Dawes Act, which encouraged assimilation, which was reservations will be allocated not to tribes, but to individual Indians, 160 acres. A lot of the best land went to large speculators. It went to railroads. It was also, remember, this is a very hard scrabble existence. It's very hard to make a living on 160 acres, which is why like 2/3 of homesteaders went bust. Like small farming was just hard. I mean, we spent all year talking about economies of scale, right? And how bigger is better. And when you start to need a lot of large capital investment, that only works on a larger scale. And so much of Indian land was lost as a result of the Dawes Act. Helen Hunt Jackson wrote the famous book, A Century of Dishonor, in 1881, which led to the passage of the Dawes Act to try and, like, it's weird. It was like, let's be nicer to Indians, but let's destroy their culture and civilize them. So you saw like the Carlisle in Pennsylvania, Carlisle Indian Industrial School. The last real resistance after all the Indian tribes had been defeated by the late 1870s, early 1880s, was that 1890 Ghost Dance movement, where a number of Lakota Sioux were at Wounded Knee, surrounded by the army. The details are a little foggy, but we learned in class about the number of Indian deaths and how it was like really the last type of organization that was designed to resist what was going on to the reservation. And then FDR with the Indian Reorganization Act said, all right, let's bring back the idea of tribes, and the reservation system, while it remained in abject poverty, was centered more towards the Indian tribe rather than individual Indians. In California, in all the territory taken from the Mexican cession, and this was covered pretty well in your book, former Mexicans now living in America are largely marginalized by the system. Most of them lose land through legal or illegal means. More things as we talk about, like one of the big things about the West, and I'm not pushing any agenda, like it was really harsh on the environment, right? Like, okay, you hear that there's gold, you send lonely individual prospectors to placer mine, which is where, you know, you got like the shovel and the pan, right? And then you engage in deep shaft mining, which is like you drill really far down, or strip mining, where you strip everything off, or hydraulic mining, where you just blast everything with water jets. And so we always talked about conservation as being like part of the progressive movement, and certainly progressives embraced it, but we started to see a movement here of like, wait a second, we need to save, you know, whether you're a conservationist, which wants like scientific management of resources for future development, or a preservationist, which wants like hands off, people realize like we have to protect against deforestation. Yellowstone becomes our first national park. Yosemite becomes a state park and then a national park. The new Department of the Interior is created to try to scientifically manage our natural resources, which both of those do. And of course, the most famous preservationist, John Muir, arguing that some land had to remain untouched. Good, I think that's covering it for the West. We've got some more stuff coming, like farmer protest. All right, I can handle this. So small farmers didn't make it. The number of farms diminishes and diminishes and diminishes as the 19th century progresses, because farming becomes much more heavily capitalized. It's just too hard of an environment to make it as a small independent farmer. And there's a lot of money from back east that finances this. And so farmers got bigger, and the smaller farmer, to try to compete, what do they have to do? You have to borrow money. What do you have to do to borrow money? You have to put up collateral. What do you have to put up collateral? Your farm. Oh, what's happening at this time? Well, there's a very small cartel of bankers that keep interest rates artificially high. There's not really competition for interest rates. And on top of that, what's happening? Are we having inflation or deflation? Deflation. Remember, we're producing so much more stuff. We are cranking stuff out. Our economy is growing, but the money supply stays fixed to gold. That's called the gold standard. And unless you expand the money supply, that's less money to purchase each item. So each dollar becomes more valuable because you have deflation. And so what happens to farm prices? They plummet. They plummet across the board, not only because of deflation, but also because of so much increased international competition from places like Russia. And the Stanford woman can go through the rise of European agriculture with you. I'm not. And Canada as well starts to export a lot. So farm prices are falling, and farmers are completely beholden to Eastern bankers and Eastern railroaders. Who do farmers hate? Eastern bankers, Eastern railroaders. And it's also like the middlemen. Farmers couldn't buy anything directly themselves. So, you know, they're buying a plow. Well, a middleman buys it, and then of course jacks up the price. because the middleman doesn't do anything except serve as a middleman. And so we start to see farmers organize. The Grange movement of the late 1860s, wanting to sell things as cooperatives. And the Grange movement, hey, America's a democracy, right? Votes count. And we started to see a lot of Granger laws being passed. Like Illinois regulated what railroads could charge to use their grain elevators. Like what you would, you'd store your grain before it would be shipped. And like railroads look, I don't want to get lost in the weeds, but railroads could do whatever they wanted because like you had a little bit of competition with the long hauls, with like railroads that went a long way across state lines. But like the short hauls, like just in between towns, like in Nebraska, there might only be one railroad. And so it would cost way more to ship something a short distance than a long distance because there was zero competition to ship it a short distance. So Granger laws regulated everything about the railroads, and Munn versus Illinois, as we learned about in class, what was that, 1877, ruled in favor of the state being able to regulate economic activity, which was in the public interest, such as setting maximum freight rates. However, like the railroads, they're no fools. They just start to make all of their lines run between states. In Wabash versus Illinois, the court now interprets like basically all rail travel as being interstate commerce, which is only subject to federal, not state regulation. So as we learned in class, basically every state regulatory law involving the railroads is wiped out in 1886 with Wabash. As we mentioned before, the Interstate Commerce Commission is ostensibly created to protect farmers from railroads, but in reality, it just helps railroads. The Interstate Commerce Commission, they have a very vague charge to make sure that shipping rates are reasonable and just. That is subject to interpretation, and they really never won in court. What they did do was benefit railroads in that by establishing rates, they prevented destructive competition and permitted railroads to operate more efficiently. So farmers got together in 1890 in Ocala, Florida, and came up with the Ocala platform, which is basically everything I'm going to review in 2 chapters with the populist movement. Graduated income tax, sub-treasury, direct election of senators, expanding the money supply, right? National banking system. And it doesn't really come out of anything, but I just want you to see the seeds of populism are sown. And then, of course, one more time, the frontier. One of the cool things, as I was rereading everything to sound semi-intelligent speaking to you, was like, you think about changes in what's happened in 35 years. You go from basically nobody out in like the great American desert to like the West is completely settled in 1890, right? It went so fast that every piece of land was taken. Everything had become a state except New Mexico, Arizona, Oklahoma, right? But of course, Oklahoma would become a state soon as Indian land in Oklahoma was now opened up into white settlement. And remember, Frederick Jackson Turner says, this is a really big deal because we owe pretty much everything in America to the frontier being the great leveler, promoting of social equality, promoting of democracy, and of course, serving as that outlet for malcontents, right? Things aren't going good for me, so I'll just face north and turn left, right? I can always go west. And while nobody really believes Turner's thesis today, it's a real oversimplification. Back then, it was a really big deal in American history that the West had been settled. And what I wanted to make sure you got in that review is how it went so fast, right? Big mining came in, big ranching came in, big farming came in, right? All behind big money. And like your sod busting homesteader, like 2/3 of them take the train. And that's why you see a boom in urbanization in the 1880s, really in the 1890s, because it was so hard to make it as a small farmer out west. Speaking of hard, the South has to try to recover from the Civil War, and it's tough. All right, good. We went into all of that stuff. All right. All right, I can cover this. All right, sorry, this stuff's tougher. It's a lot easier to tell the story leading up to the Civil War. All right, so the New South, it's tough because, all right, you have 3.5 million freed slaves, and as we learned, by 1877, all 11 Reb states have been redeemed, right? And what we saw was a system where, okay, there were all these laws in place to promote the new birth of freedom that Lincoln had talked about, and they're just gone, 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 gone. Remember, we had the Civil Rights Act of first of 1866, which is in perpetuity with the passage of the 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law, due process under the law guaranteed. Then you had the outgoing, what's the animal? Lame duck. The outgoing lame duck Republican Congress of 1875 passing the Civil Rights Act, which forbid discrimination in any public accommodation. And as I mentioned before, with the civil rights cases, the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. Private acts of discrimination are private, and you can't legislate that. And we talked about how in Plessy in 1896, an all-white Democratic Louisiana government started to say, in the interest of public safety, we're separating black people and white people. And one of the ways they did that was on railroad cars. Remember, we put Homer Plessy up, 1/8 black, looks white. And as part of an early civil rights movement wants to say that these laws violate the 14th Amendment to equal protection. And remember, other than Justice Harlan, the court said that these laws were designed to promote, the 14th Amendment was to ensure political, not social equality. And when they wrote that law, they never would have assumed that there would be equality in all places. And okay, I'm gonna go off the rails here, but remember we talked about in the Strouder case in Virginia, where somebody was denied to be on a jury because the law was written and explicitly said you must be white to be on a jury. That was the deprivation of a political right. And we talked about how these all-white Democratic governments found all sorts of ways to disenfranchise, to rewrite their constitution, again, ostensibly for public safety, to say we got to make sure we got good people in the polls. So you got to pass a literacy test, right? You got to pay a poll tax. You're exempt from that, though, if your grandfather voted. And of course, when you talk about white primaries, Democratic Party, where do you see some of the stuff that we learn about this? The Alabama Democratic Party in the 1960s had as its symbol a rooster, and the heading was, the label was white supremacy. So the only way you could be in the Democratic Party was if you were white. And guess what every politician was in the South? Well, Democrat. And we learned about how we really learned the Williams versus Mississippi case from 1898, which dealt with the 1890 Mississippi Constitution, that just said, hey, look, all of this stuff here, literacy test, poll taxes, grandfather clauses exist. And it didn't say, like, this is going to be applied to black people only. But the way that it was applied at the local level was so discriminatory. But the Supreme Court, again, at a time where extreme deference was given to state governments, said, oh, no, the way that the Constitution is written, there's no problem. And we said that resulted in all white juries in the South as well. And then, of course, one of the things that we talked about was, there's violence. And while the Klan doesn't resurface until right after World War I, you saw lynch mobs, right? And you had 1,800, and that's on the record, 1,800 black people lynched in the 1890s. And you had individuals like Ida B. Wells challenge that with their anti-lynching campaign from northern newspapers. You had some limited African-American migration out of the area. We're going to really look at that, though, in the context of World War I, right? That's where we saw 1 out of 7 black people in the South leave. Economic discrimination, remember, your only opportunity is sharecropping. And everyone's poor in the South because there really was no education in the South. So while you had development, to just jump up here for a second, okay, bully for you had an integrated railroad network, and you had steel in areas like Birmingham, lumber in areas like Memphis, tobacco in areas like Richmond. You had 250,000 people employed in the textile industry with a very uneducated and unskilled workforce. And remember, the South is devastated after the Civil War. So It's like, are you willing to work on the cheap? Yes, right? And you saw different approaches to this, whether it was George Washington Carver, who uh, argued for agricultural diversity because the South was relying on cotton, huge glut in the cotton market. Cotton prices get cut in half in the 1890s. More and more people, both white and black, are living as sharecroppers because they fell into a cycle of debt. And remember, we described sharecropping as sort of like quasi-serfdom. The Tuskegee Institute was an early college for Black agricultural studies. Booker T. Washington said the most powerful ballot is the color green. And he said, rather than challenge the prevailing discrimination in the South, the Jim Crow South, develop yourself economically, and then you'll have to be accepted by white society. Praised by some for advocating like black ownership of business, and then criticized by others for the accommodation of racism. I think I got it all. I think I got it all. All right. Good stuff. See, told you there's a lot of words there, but it's not as difficult. Like, I didn't mention Henry Grady. He was the editor of the, oh boy, Atlanta Constitution, who argued vehemently for this new South and was like, hey, business open in the South, right? We won't tax you. People will work for nothing, right? And you, even though the South remains primarily agricultural, that new South was the idea of more business than before the Civil War coming there. So I think that's it, guys. I will see you with the next section.